Oh, okay. I'm still recording. You can't count me in either. Man, that was a mess.
It was perfect. It was
It was.
perfect in every way.
All right. Ready? Three. I'm counting myself in. Hey, count me in. Count me in. I can do it.
Three, two, one.
I was going for it. You messed me up. Do it again.
Three, two. One.
Welcome to Regenerated Radio, Season 4, Episode 5. This is the final episode of our series on ecclesiology. Now, there's a lot more that we could talk about regarding ecclesiology, but this is really just meant to be a broad overview and really something that would be helpful for pastors, for deacons, for church members broadly. And so that's what we're really doing today. I'm joined once again, as always, by my dear brother, Lawson Harlow, pastor of Mercy Hill Church in Olive Branch, Mississippi, and Lieutenant Commander Wesley Russell, pastor of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Pikeville, Kentucky. Good evening, brethren. How art thou?
Good evening, thou art well.
Thou art well.
Hello, hello.
So you can see we have a little bit of a different setup here. I'm in a box, and they're in boxes too. And so if you're on YouTube, if you're listening to what I'm talking about on Anchor, you probably just think I'm a crazy person. So that's fine because that's more or less true. But a couple of quick notes of housekeeping before we actually jump into our conversation today, which we're going to keep a little bit shorter than we have the past couple of times. But first and foremost, we are working through, like I said, the best and most cost-effective ways of recording these. I'm not sure that this is it, but this is what we're doing today. And so I've been working on OBS and trying to make it look nice. And so I'm sure some technical issues will arise at some point today because we are a professional operation. But also, another thing to note is that we've been working on our calendar of episodes, the things that we want to talk about over the course of the next few months. And so if you have something that you'd really like us to cover, please email us at regeneratedradionet no, not .com, at gmail.com. And then you can send that to us. We'll do our best to address it on the show at some point. And maybe we can even have like a mailbag day where if we get a bunch of questions from people, we can just open them and answer them ad nauseum. So that'd be a lot of fun. So definitely hit us with those questions and we'll try to schedule something for that. But today we're talking about the responsibilities of the congregation within church life. Our first episode on ecclesiology, we kind of established some of these things, talked about the congregation as a corporate entity, and how it rules itself in that way. But we need to work out what that looks like, really on an individual basis. And that means that this episode should be very, very helpful to the laymen in particular in our churches as you reckon with what your responsibilities are as a devoted member of the local church. And so I think that the way that we're going to go about doing this is just kind of discuss some of the biblical passages in particular that are really helpful for this. And so I'm just going to kick it over to one of you guys. Lawson, you had a couple of passages, and Wes, you had one that you wanted to bring up as well. So let's go through those. Lawson, why don't you start us off with Romans, and we'll start working through some of those
What if I want to
passages.
start with First Corinthians?
You do whatever you want, brother. I'll
Cool.
follow
We're
your
going to
lead.
start with First Corinthians.
All right.
And the reason we're going to start with First Corinthians is I think that this is actually the starting place of all this. If we're talking about congregational responsibilities, the very first responsibility is that you love the church. And if you love the church, in reality, the rest of these are going to take care of themselves. And so if you get a bad starting ground, then you're going to have bad fruit. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 13, I don't know about y'all, but I think I've heard 1 Corinthians 13 read at almost every wedding I've ever been to.
Yeah.
And
Definitely.
every time I have this internal check that's like, should I tell him that this is not about marriage? Can it be applied? It most certainly can. However, 1 Corinthians 13 is actually first and foremost about the responsibility of the congregation to love one another, and what that really will look like. And so I'll read some of it. I'm not going to read the entirety of it, but I think this is really important. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So if we're thinking about congregational responsibility, just kind of even thinking about the way that we obey the Lord Jesus, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. I think before we dive into some of the requirements and some of the calls to the congregation, the first thing that we have to have is this firm foundation of affection. And I understand as both a pastor and a church member, because I think we fall into both of those categories, that it can be really difficult sometimes to love every member of your congregation. I think it's fair to say that we're required to love every individual because we have a common factor of union with Jesus. but that doesn't mean that we all have personalities that are uniquely amiable to one another. There are gonna be difficult relationships. I think that everybody's probably experienced that. Um, but there's this call of obedience, which is to love the body, to be patient, to be kind, to be gentle, to not keep a record of wrong. And so, the first key portion of congregational responsibility is I'm going to love my brother and my sister because we have a love for Jesus together. And if we have that first and foremost, then the rest of these really will take care of themselves. There are commandments, right? There are responsibilities that the Lord gives. But I mean, I can think of countless times where inside of our congregation, I'm looking at someone who's dealing with frustration with another member. And my first response is, hey, brother, hey, sister, are you keeping a record of wrong? Are
Yeah.
you aiming to express kindness? Are you assuming graciously concerning this individual? Are you really starting with love, or are you starting with something else that really needs to be put to death? And so, before we get into any of the congregational responsibilities, I think that's the foundation that has to be laid. And Paul in First Corinthians is laying out this really firm foundation of knowledge puffs up and love builds up. And so, if we're going to aim to uphold congregational responsibilities, you kind of have to go to the root of love first and foremost.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's something that I think is unfortunately a big struggle in modern churches today because so many times, especially with the way that churches push numbers and growth, and we try to get into these situations where suddenly there's this massive amount of people in a small church, or not even necessarily a small church, but think of the mega church environment where you come together, and the basis is not love for one another. The basis is consumerism. The basis is how can we get something out of the church service for ourselves without really making those interconnections. And yeah, I mean, it really does defeat the purposes of love, loving one another. I would say so. That's really good. Wes, what do you think?
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind is Hebrews 10:25. Don't forsake the assembling of yourselves, and that whole thing is is really centered around fellowship for each other, love for each other. And I saw this on social media, and I don't think I'd ever thought about it till several years ago. I'd probably thought about it, but not as clear as this social media like tweet photo was going around, and it said, you may not need to go to church tomorrow and have fellowship and have the love of others. But how dare you deprive the person who does need you to go tomorrow and love them and have an affection for them? And I too similarly cringe every time um, 1 Corinthians 13 starts getting rattled off at weddings because it's like, all right, uh, good principles here. I mean, you guys should probably love each other like this as well. Did you read the first 12 chapters of this? Like,
Yeah.
are we going to kick some immoral people out of this wedding right now, or are we delivering certain people over to Satan here and all of that? Yeah, that just comes to mind. Hebrews 10:25. It's like the whole the whole point of whoever's preaching that in Hebrews 10 is, hey, you guys need to be there for each other and love each other. And I don't know who it is.
It's Paul.
But yeah, that was just the first thing that came to my mind about what you said, Lawson.
Yeah. What actually jumped to my mind while you were talking about that, and this isn't one that we had talked about before actually beginning a recording, but I was just thinking through Ephesians. I just finished preaching through Ephesians recently, and you get to Ephesians 4, right? And what do you have within that but this call, saying that when you were coming together, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. And so, as you're thinking about the relationship that you ought to have, and your responsibility truly as a member of a local congregation, it really does come down to that foundational principle of love and bearing with one another in love in that way. And unfortunately, in our fallen state, it does actually take bearing with one another. We have, we're going to have problems within the body. We're going to have points of tension, and we're going to have arguments, and yet we need to recognize that we're called to bear with one another in those ways. And so much of the New Testament is concerned with these one another commands, and all of those can only really be fulfilled within the context of a local church. So we've, somebody mentioned it. I can't remember which one of you just said it, but somebody was mentioned. Oh, I guess Wes, you were talking about Hebrews 10:25. We need to come together, because where else can you practice this? Like, how else are you supposed to actually to fill out these commandments, to love one another, to be unified with one another, to care for one another? I mean, there's just over and over again throughout the New Testament. You can't do it outside of the body of the local church. So that's absolutely foundational. So good point.
Yeah.
So Wes, what you brought up Matthew 16, right? You want to
Yeah,
fill that out for us a bit?
I was kind of just thinking earlier today about I'm teaching through Psalm 121 tonight, and been doing a word study on what it means that the Lord is our keeper.
Hmm.
And so I was in Matthew doing some other reading, and I just read through Matthew 16, just trying to do some speed reading. And it was just fitting because we're talking about Congregationalism tonight. And the the thing that the thing that really convinced me to not just be a pew Baptist, I guess, I wasn't raised a Christian, but I've always been a Baptist since I became a Christian. It just takes some of us less time to get it right, I guess. I don't know.
Yes,
Um,
sir.
yeah, but seriously though, like, I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I was basically Baptist by osmosis because that's the bus that came and picked me up. So why not? Why not? But the study of Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 is really what forced me to reckon with, okay, well, how does the church work? Because obviously, so like, this is every Presbyterian friend I've ever had who's came over to Congregationalism. It's been because in the epistles, well, the church has to have some sort of authority because that's who they're writing to. Like, it can't just not have any authority whatsoever, right? And it's forced them to reckon with these things. And I also had to go through just the epistles and say, okay, well, they're appointing elders, so is it elder ruled and elder led, like, or is this? And then ultimately, I think really the argument lies in who did Jesus give the keys to, right? Um, and Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 talk about, or Matthew 16 precisely talks about Jesus giving the keys over to somebody. Our Catholic neighbors think obviously that they gave the keys to Peter himself. Um, but we have to look at Matthew 16 and ask ourselves, okay, well, who is receiving the keys? And uh, this is when they're at Caesarea Philippi. He's asking Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" Finally, Peter replies, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And then he strictly charged them to say no more. You don't really get the binding and loosing language until you get to Matthew 18. And ironically, what is Jesus talking about? He's talking about the church and how we handle sin with each other and how we handle discipline with each other and so on and so forth. And then he uses that phrase again, whatever's bound in heaven or bound on earth will be bound in heaven. So you have to ask yourself, well, when Jesus says you, and the best explanation of this, and I'm not co-signing off on everything that Jonathan Leeman has out, but the best explanation of this has really been given. I think the person who's done the most language work on Matthew 16 through 19, is probably Jonathan Leeman, trying to figure out who the you is. When he says, "I give you the keys to the kingdom." Um, and then Puritans handle this pretty well. I don't know how most of them weren't Congregationalists, but the language work there is pretty good for them as well. But when I think of those two passages, I think of the two main things that Jesus has given us in those. In Matthew 16, you get this massive profession that you are the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the promised one that we've been anticipating since creation, since Genesis chapter 3. That's you. And then in Matthew 18, you see this disciplinary passage happening. So I would break up the two main roles of the congregation. When I think of congregationalism, I think of the fact that the congregation of a church has the final say in both doctrine and discipline. What they confess that he is Christ and what they practice in discipline. And those are explicit as well. Like, I have a copy of my church bylaws right here. I actually have like so many copies.
Whoa.
This is tons of copies, guys, because we hand them out to our new members. But this is just chapter 1, guys. But no, and we get to decide what we believe here, right? But also by implication, because the church chooses its leaders. It chooses who preaches week in and week out, and who preaches what doctrine. And then also by discipline, we have explicit disciplinary authority by God, because we're able to go to people, and we see not only Matthew 18 but 1 Corinthians that we can discipline people to the point of handing them over to Satan. But also by implication, by we decide who's a member of our church, So that would be kind of my summary statement for Matthew 16, Matthew 18, is the congregation has the ultimate authority, or not the ultimate authority, but we have been given the ultimate authority by God for both doctrine and discipline.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
think
actually
that's
like
a
that. Yeah, go ahead.
no. I was just gonna say I think that's a helpful way to really even summarize what it means to be a congregationalist. Is that as Wes just laid out, is that Jesus really placed the power there, right? The primary weight is given to them first and foremost, not necessarily as individuals, but as a whole. Which is just super important for, like, as we're looking forward to congregational responsibilities of the interconnectivity of the body. It's like you have to look at it from both the whole, the entire organism, if we can use that language, and then the individuals and their responsibilities one to another. Like, one is how does the body as a whole function, and the other one is how does the one particular cell of the body function in relation to the others.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think we see that, Greg, you just got done preaching through Ephesians, so you'll know the exact passage like immediately off the top of your head. I think it's Ephesians 2. But think about this with Old Testament temple language.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then being the shadow being satisfied in us, Christ's church. We are His temple. Our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. But there is both an individual and a corporate satisfaction of that. God's glory resting on the temple, rests on the believer, the priesthood of the believer, but also this idea of the corporate church
Yeah.
that we have.
Yeah, that flies into the distinction in First Peter, and you have that we are assembly. We're made up of a grouping, right? We are a temple made up of what, living stones, but each of those stones is an individual living stone, and it needs to mesh together with the rest of the temple well. But yeah, I think that's really helpful. And thinking through that idea, that kind of language, I tried to use that a little bit when we were talking through Ephesians, when I was going through that passage that you're mentioning from Ephesians 2. With Christ as our cornerstone, and then the foundations of the apostles and the prophets. Like, what does all that mean? Well, that means that we are affirming as a local church, as a congregation of believers, as a grouping of living stones, that these are the things that we believe. These are the confession that Peter made, right? That's the foundation of the church. Well, we want to mirror that confession as best we can and come together within that. So those stones have to sort of fit together. This actually kind of sort of moves into why it's so important to be able to understand division regarding secondary issues between denominations and things like that. Like, I want to be able to affirm that these people over here are Christians, but we're a local congregation here established upon this confession of faith, which is, again, to why it's so important to have confessions. But maybe that was probably a whole other conversation than what I want to get into. So. Well, that said, then I kind of want to transition a little bit into what does that mean then for, like, the individual congregant. We're talking about people who are coming together. They have a specific set of doctrines, and they have a specific discipline or an orthopraxy, a way that they go forward then and display what they believe and the way that they act with one another within the church. So knowing all of that, then, like, what are some of the ways in which you'd see congregants having particular responsibilities, or maybe, I have Wes, you had your constitution, we have my constitution next to me as well at the church covenant and things like that. So what are some of the things that you guys would say are outworkings of that? Or Lawson, I guess we didn't go to Romans. If you want to cover that real quick too, we can do that.
Well, I think Romans is a good discussion point for a minute. Like
Mm-hmm.
the if you want to do church covenants first, that's fine. I was just looking at
No,
it.
go
So
ahead.
from the huh?
No, go ahead. It's fine.
Okay, so I would like to talk about these and kind of think about ways that we could apply them to the life of our individual members, our churches at large, which is Romans 12. So I preach through Romans. Wes, where are you at in Romans right
I have
now?
Romans 5:3.
Okay, so you still got a minute before you hit 12, I
Yeah.
imagine. But so like working your way through the book of Romans and then arriving at Romans 12, you really do have this pivot. And the pivot is, okay, now how does that work itself out in the life of a local church? Like, what does it look like to embody justification by faith alone? What does it look like to be a people declared righteous, to be a we can debate this a different time, but to be the Israel of God. And and so as you're looking at Romans chapter 12, the really interesting portion of this to me is you have two major sections, and this is what I would like to maybe spur us up in conversation about. So you have Romans 12, which is the introduction of offer your bodies as a living sacrifice unto God. This is essentially living in a worshipful state of being, offering yourself up to the Lord. And then you have this manifestation of this that is instantaneous to Paul, which is inside of the faith family, which I think is really interesting. Growing up, like I grew up in youth group, right? So your body as a living sacrifice was the only thing I ever heard. Nobody ever continued reading Romans 12. A friend of mine says everybody likes to be reformed till it's time to do reformed things,
Oh yeah.
which is why everybody's Bible is really marked up from Romans 1 to 11. You get to 12 and you're like, did y'all stop? Like finish the book. Um, but 12, you have this layout of what it looks like to be a member of
Overpreached in the wrong way, right?
yeah.
But all of the unity it takes to actually be able to confidently say that you are one body with many members that function in a proper way, especially in light of the first two verses of Romans 12 about being transformed, being conformed to the image of Christ together, so on and so forth. That's the first thing that pops into my mind, Lawson, is you suffer together, you
Yeah.
rejoice together. As Craig said earlier, it really is a bearing with one another.
Greg?
Yeah, no. So I mean, again, you're going through Romans. I went through Ephesians. Ephesians jumps to my mind again too. Especially you get to chapter 4, even into chapter 5. Really, the whole second half of Ephesians is discussing this. Like, how are we meant to live with one another? How are we meant to walk worthy in the Lord? It's not just an individual exhortation. Like the whole of it is actually discussing how do you speak to one another? How do you act toward one another? Ephesians 4:17. Now I say and testify in the Lord that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. And he goes on and he discusses like what they had done. They as a group, as Gentiles, had become callous and given themselves up to all of these greedy practices, etc. But that is not the way that you learn Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and taught in him as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self. But all of these things are actually all the injunctions that come after that in verses 25 through 30. And then as you get into chapter 5 in particular, it starts to talk about this sort of like mutual submission idea, how we ought to love one another and put one another before ourselves and honor one another, right? Those are the commands that you do within the context of the local church. And so when you're talking about one body of many members, really the goal is to understand that everyone needs to put other people ahead of themselves and honor people ahead of themselves, so that the body can continue to function well. Because if the hand decides that the hand is the most important thing, then things start to fall apart really quickly. But if the hand decides that it needs to serve the rest of the body in the way that it's intended to, then things function well. And so God has put us together. He has ordained us in these ways so that we can function well. without our bodies crumbling. Wes, I thought your analogy there of your knee surgery is a helpful one. So
Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I
go ahead,
don't know
Wes.
what you were trying to get across, Lawson, but like immediately I was like, oh man, like you can't isolate one part of a body. Like you just
Mm-mm.
can't.
You
Like
literally can't. Yeah.
you cannot. And it just popped in my head.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about this, we often go to those examples, and I think those are spot on, right? Like, I use the illustration often, which is like a cancer cell is one cell in the body that spirals out of control, and it affects and damages the entirety of the body until the cancer cell is dealt with, or really the cells at that point, right? But the other portion of this, like that's kind of in the negative of the weep with those who weep and caring for one another. The thing that I think we often misunderstand, we get it when it comes to pastoral ministry, but I'm not sure we get it when it comes to general service of members of the congregation one to another. So, for instance, on Sunday morning, not everybody preaches.
Mhm.
Fair? Okay. So, but was a sermon preached to the church? Yes, right? The mouth is functioning essentially in a way that it should to the edification of the entire body. The word was proclaimed. It doesn't matter if it's you or another elder. It doesn't matter if it's just a gifted brother who happens to preach that day, right? Um, but one of the things that as we
Be
were preaching
quiet,
through Romans
please.
12 that I found to be like it was just a light bulb moment for me was what the hand does, the whole body does. And so, for instance, while we were in the
Hey, be
hospital with
quiet
Patton,
out the side the door.
he was when he was
Go
born, he was in the
away.
NICU for about a month. I had a couple of church members, for instance, bring food to us. We had two church members drive down to just be with us for a little bit. And so the question is, did the hand do that or did the body do that? The body did it. It's like not every member is going to be able to make their way to me. Not every member is going to be able to care for me. Not every member is going to be able to provide a meal. I think what we often do when we think about life inside the church is we think about people and not the whole. And so, for instance, I can say, hey, Jim is just a really faithful brother. He loves me really well, right? And that's true. But I think I have to be able to say in the same vein that this church serves me really well whenever Jim
Yes.
serves me really well
Yeah.
Yeah.
because what the hand does, the whole body's doing. Just like you said, right? Your knees hurt, so you have the recoil that comes from that. But I mean, when you finish when you finish an excellent workout, your whole body that you may have just worked out, upper body or something like that,
Yeah.
you have the effect throughout the entirety. It's like, oh, my whole body is affected by the action of one. The whole body has done the activity. And I think inside the church, we've got to reclaim the idea that not everybody has to be the one that shows up. Not everybody has to be the one who preaches. Not everybody has to be the really wealthy individual who is able to give freely. We simply say, this is the way the church cares for us.
I can't tell you. Like there's a couple of different times in the life of the church that I've been in here, specifically the life of the church that I was at in Houston, where you have people who will get frustrated when they come in. They come in for a
Mm.
short amount of time, and then something happens in their life, and something traumatic, and they'll claim that the church did not broadly like surround them or contend. They use language like that makes it seem like this horrible thing. But ultimately, what ended up happening within all the situations that I'm thinking of, at least, are a pastor or a couple of people within the church really decided that they were going to pour into this family or this person's life or this person who's going through marital issues. And there's two or three men in the church who are coming around this guy, and yet because the entire church isn't like surrounding them, they feel as if the church isn't doing its job.
Yeah.
But that's not you can't have that expectation. It's way too much, and it's outside of the scope of. I believe you're right in your interpretation there. I think it's outside of the scope of Scripture to expect that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even logically, it just wouldn't make any sense whatsoever in a New Testament cultural setting for Paul or Peter or any of these apostles to mean that everyone in the church in Jerusalem needs to come and minister to you in your little 6x8 hut that you live in.
Yeah.
It, and that's just, but yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't work. Well, really quickly then, before we wrap up, I would like to just address the idea of. Are you saying something, Lawson?
I'm laughing at you because you're saying wrap up. We've been here for 5 minutes, Greg.
I know, but we took a long time beforehand. I'm trying to
Okay,
make
I'm
these
sorry.
shorter. Okay? I don't want it to be like an hour and a half every time. So we were going longer than I meant this to be beforehand. So, although we may have to lengthen these at some point, I don't know. We're still toying around, so bear with us. Anyway, I do want to quickly go over just the idea, more or less, more than anything, just the idea of a church covenant. Like, what is do you? I mean, I'm sure you both have church covenants. I think we've already mentioned that of some sort. Like, what is it that you guys kind of front load your people with as they're coming into the church, and what are the sort of appropriate kind of exhortations that you give within it? And then, have you seen anything weird in some other ones, maybe?
Well, the popular church covenants around uh, this area, I mean, they ban alcohol, tobacco use.
Can I
You
read you
can't.
something from mine?
Please,
We're
Yeah,
working on
well,
our.
please.
here's the thing. I guarantee you, whoever planted your church went to a Bible bookstore and just bought the church covenant off the wall. That my church bought off the Bible bookstore. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
well,
but
so
yeah,
this
go ahead
this
and
one
read.
this one says, and mostly it's really good. It has to be just in our dealings, faithful in our engagements, exemplary in our deportment, to avoid all tattling, backbiting, and excessive anger, and then to abstain from the sale of, use of, abstain from the sale of and use of destructive drugs or intoxicating drinks as a beverage, right? And then there's other things in there as well. But like, it's funny that those things are baked into so many covenants from, like you said, from just that time period. Anyway, continue. Sorry.
No, it's just. I mean, as far as church covenants goes, that's the one I'm most familiar with. And we have that church covenant framed somewhere in some closet here at church.
Some
Like
closet.
massive, but my church has existed for 70, 80 years and they've never changed the bylaws. I've been here for going, or like, they've never changed bylaws, constitution, anything. I've been here going on 3 years, and next Wednesday night, I'm about to change it for like the fifth time,
My
right?
guy.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've added in some stuff about our confession at church is the New Hampshire confession. Like, that's what it is. Um, the truly confessional people are probably aggravated that I've added little things in here. Who cares? But a lot of it's been like a statement on biblical sexuality just to protect us
Yeah.
from the
Uh,
gays, right?
That's necessary
I
these days.
literally, I'm so glad you said that because I need to add that to ours.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and here's the thing, I have no shame in saying this. I just emailed Heath Lambert and said, "Can I have this?" What he did down
Yeah.
at First Baptist Jacks.
Hmm.
He was like, "I don't, yeah." You know what I mean? It's just, and I literally just copied and pasted what he had
Yeah.
and added it to our confession. But with that, um, one of the things that we'll get to here is the church covenant. You know what I mean? And so me and a lot of other people here have gone through several things. Of course, you have to be a Christian. Uh, it necessitates um, being a faithful Christian to your local church.
Hmm.
But one of the things that we're going to incorporate in our new church covenant is the stress that the local or that your church is your primary ministry.
Hmm.
Oh, yes.
Um,
I love that.
that
Yeah.
that if you're going to be a member of the church, then it's not I'm a member of Emmanuel Baptist Church, but my real ministry is XYZ. No, no, no. Our ministry here for members at Emmanuel is Emmanuel. I mean, that's our ministry.
Hmm.
Not to say that you can't have podcasts or not to say that you can't head up a 501c3. I do both of those, right? Um, but the first and foremost, the primary ministry of the saint is the local church. And there's going to be a heavy emphasis on that. And like I said, it's not to say that parachurch things are completely useless, but it is to say that it's pretty close, you know. like like but the main things that we've wrote down are six of them, and it's kind of under this idea of being a member of a church. You have privileges, but you also have responsibilities. So one example of a privilege is If you haven't came to our church in 15 to 20 years and you just randomly show up and you need us to pay a couple $1,000 to get you out of a lawsuit or something crazy like that, well, one of the privileges of being a member of a local church is you have people who can financially care for you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So not to say that we at Emmanuel just deny everybody outside of our church who needs help.
Right.
That's not what I'm saying. But I do make sure to stress to
Yep.
outsiders, like, do you realize this is one of the privileges of being a church member?
Yep. Had
Like
that exact
it's
phone
not
call
just
yesterday.
a responsibility, you know. So I'll make this quick. I keep rambling. One is to be dedicated to the church in prayer and service. Those two things. To be
Yeah.
dedicated to the church, that's a responsibility. Two, to be clear and transparent in your relationships with others, right? Within the church. To Matthew 18, just to be clear and transparent. If you sin against them, confess, apologize, or confess and repent, vice versa. Three, submit to the church's leadership. Four, to promote the unity in the body. Five, to use spiritual gifts to build up the body however they can. 1 Corinthians 12. There's only five of them. I'm sorry. But yeah, um, it and you can find what I just said in every book on church membership, on
Yeah.
elders. Uh, I'm sure I'm sure that that's a lot of 9 Marks language. I'm sure that's a lot of biblical eldership language. It's my favorite book on that. But a lot of this comes from who convinced John Owen to become a Congregationalist? John Cotton?
It wouldn't be
I'm
Cotton.
not a historian.
Cotton would
No,
be
it would have been
after
John.
Owen.
Anyways, whoever wrote the book Keys to the Kingdom, uh, John Owen got a hold of that work, and that's why he made the Savoy Declaration.
Hmm.
But a lot of that comes from that. Like, okay, Christ gave us the keys, and what are those keys? There's privileges, there's responsibilities, and so on and so forth. But that is what hopefully in a year from now our church covenant will look like here.
Yeah, like I'm reading through ours. It has a lot of the same sort of language in it, but it's just kind of built in with a lot of other things too. I think one thing that's really helpful with this kind of document too is to keep it simple. Like what you just did, you have 5 points, and they're five very easy to remember points, and they're points that are biblical. They're very easy to back up with scripture. A lot of times, church covenants that I've seen will like get into very nitty gritty stuff. I mean, like the clause on alcohol earlier. We want to make sure that we are using language that is a pretty broad catch all for those kinds of things. Like if and not necessarily those kinds of things, but you know what I'm saying. As far as if we're going to put something under discipline, then it needs to be understood that like this is what the church believes regarding that, and that we do actually discipline uh, for folks for breaking their covenant in that regard. So, uh,
Yeah,
Lawson,
could
you
you
look like
imagine
you.
if we were disciplining everyone who used chewing tobacco?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Well, I mean, I live in the Appalachian Mountains, so it's like I don't use it, so I guess I'd be here, right? Like
Yeah,
these are examples that I've used to my congregation about our church covenant. Like
right,
I know there's people who consume alcohol here. You've broken the church, you know what I mean? You've broken the
right.
church
Mhm.
covenant, and
We
so
need to be more careful than that. Lawson, you look like you were about to bust a blood vessel there. What's up?
When was this?
You were just
No, I
staring like
wasn't.
really intensely for a
Oh,
second.
I was listening. I'm an active listener.
Okay, good job.
But I mean, on our church covenant, we have like an actual formal church covenant, and then we have expectations of members.
Hmm.
And my joke for expectation of members is we just expect you to act like a Christian.
Yeah,
Like so ours is be devoted to regular Bible intake, be devoted to fellowship, be devoted to the ordinances of God, namely the Lord's Supper and baptism, be devoted to prayer, be a joyful giver of whatever the Lord leads you to give financially, which the tithe conversation is obviously one that's an interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and then this is one of the most important ones we have in here. Uh, be willing to accept reproof, correction, and training in righteousness.
Yes.
In our new members class, I literally every single time I tell them that if you want us to be your pastor, you should expect to be pastored, and we shouldn't be afraid to lose you when we pastor you.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I can't tell you how many times in the past I have seen a church member. Growing up in my hometown, there were 3 Baptist churches. Everybody rotated between the three. When one pastor offended, you just went to the next one, and the cycle
Yep.
continued. And so,
Circuit riders.
yeah, exactly. It's so weird.
Yeah.
And so like it's I- if we're gonna actually be biblical Christians, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness is normative. It's actually normative. It's
Yeah.
not even abnormal. It's a regular occurrence in the life of the church. And it does not normatively come from the pastor. It normatively comes from members one to another. And so, like, if we're gonna actually uphold biblical church membership, and we're gonna uphold what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus, then it means that you're gonna be reproofing and correcting and training in righteousness. And no one should be afraid. Oh, I'm gonna lose my brother if I tell them, "Hey, you
Yeah.
can't be a drunkard." Right? No,
Yeah.
no, no. This is part of a church membership. Is like these have to be affirmed.
Yeah. And all that, I mean, really all that goes back to the idea of bearing with one another in love and building one another up.
Yep.
Building one another up. I mean, how often are we told to edify one another and to exhort one another and to build one another up? And we do those things through the teaching of the truth. Like
Yep.
that's I mean, I had a whole lecture on this at the conference this past weekend, talking about how we do that within music. You know, the words that we sing within the songs that we sing ought to be very carefully analyzed, because they are teaching, and they are for a purpose. They're transformative, right? They're didactic. They teach, and so when we speak to one another, you know, everyone looks to the pastor for doctrine teaching. You know, and I could say that just as much as anybody. We're always up there preaching. We're doing Bible studies. We're doing Sunday evenings and Wednesday nights and whatever else. We have all these studies and studies and studies, but how often, and truly, how often is it more common to see a transformational moment in the life of a believer come in just a regular conversation that you're having with somebody else, where they say, "Hey, man, like, you seem like you're struggling with this. Have you thought about this scripture and how it addresses that?" And that little simple little moment, it tends to catch on a lot more than the sermons that we preach, a lot more than the Bible studies that we go through. It's just a quick moment and a reproof from one person to another within the congregation that edifies them and ultimately brings them into more Christ-likeness. And that's what we want. But frankly, our church covenant should reflect that. Like, the whole thing should be, these are the things that we do as members of the church that enable that sort of relationship for us to do those things and come together. Yeah. All right. Well, any other thoughts? Okay. We're thoughtless.
Regenerated Radio. I have thoughts, but Greg's trying to kick me off the podcast,
so I'm not share your thoughts. It's fine. It's fine.
You scared us. We're terrified of going over now.
I don't even know what time it is. I just am here.
Fleeced.
I need to. This is on me. I need to make a larger section of time where I can actually be here to do this. So it's sort of my own fault, but appreciate you guys with that anyway. So.
No, seriously though, I will say this one last thing,
please.
And I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but the emphasis does need to be placed on the congregation. And one of the frustrating things, you all remember that article I sent you all about why in the world are Baptist churches going to plurality of elders? Oh my goodness. And they're always men. Oh my, you know?
Cringe.
And maybe we should link that.
Yeah, I'll put it in the description.
Yeah. But seriously, there are versions of this ecclesiology that are pretty bad. And what I mean by that is elder-led, congregational ruled. Like, there are versions of this that claim to be that. They are not that. And the emphasis does need to be placed on the congregation. We as elders are elders. I understand that. We are also members of our church. And that does not negate our responsibility or privileges or authority of being an elder. But I say that to church discipline is church discipline. It is not pastor discipline. It is not deacon discipline. It is not committee discipline. It's not Sunday school discipline. It's church discipline. It's congregational discipline. And oftentimes, I don't think I realized this early on in my ministry, unfortunately. It is not like this is why it's so important to have plurality of elders. This is why it's so important to have a biblical ecclesiology. Is it really, the emphasis is on the whole body?
Yeah.
We discipline each other, we comfort each other, we suffer with each other. I hate saying live life together, but we live our lives together, right? Or do life together is the one I don't like. We live our lives
Yeah.
alongside each other. Um, we do that through doctrine and we do that through discipline. We decide what we believe, right? So when you are a member of a church who maybe you're a dispensationalist, but your church is confessionally partial preterist, right? And I think that's okay, right? I mean, I my group of people here at a manual that I worship with we're all over the spectrum
Yeah,
on
same
stuff
here.
like that. You know what I mean? So, um, when you have things like that, remember this is a congregation. This is one body with many members. You do strive to keep the unity there, but remember you don't get to just dictate what your documents say. You know what I mean? It is really a congregational thing, and I think that ties back to what Lawson said about it really is this foundational issue of do you love your congregation? And I don't know, I see versions of elder led congregational ruled that it really is a dictatorship, and then oftentimes it's just a madhouse. But I do want to just, that would be my closing remarks. The emphasis is on the congregation in all of this. It's it's what they loose here is loosed in heaven, and what we bind is bound in heaven. And I think Lawson said it last week, and then I'll be quiet. Lawson, I think you said what the congregation decides is the voice of God for that congregation. You know, that's the emphasis there. That's who God's speaking through primarily at a church. So,
Yes and
Yep.
amen.
Really helpful. Lawson, any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think the individual responsibility of the congregation is just something that's often overlooked. I hesitate to call church member a third office, but if I was a three office guy, that would be the third office.
Yeah.
Um, and and reason being is because the pastor is but a man. The elders, if there be multiple, are but men. They can't. They do not have the ability to fulfill the roles of one another's in that for uniquely for each and every individual. They're to conduct themselves in that, but man, the church needs the church. At the end of the day, it can't be broken up into pieces and parts, and it can't be divided up in a and handed to one or two people. Like for instance, you take Titus 2. Titus 2 teaches us that we need older men, we need older women, we need younger men, we need younger women. And so, I just think congregational responsibility is something that needs to be communicated afresh. I think pastorally, we need to be glad hearted to tell people, I'm not the best guy for that. Jim, the member, is actually going to be better at this than me.
Yes.
And recognize where God has gifted particular people. And as Ephesians 4 says, I think even our first time we talked about this was Ephesians 4 talking about equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. Equip them for the work of the ministry and get out of the way.
Mhm.
And let them serve, let them care for one another, let them give, let them encourage, let them weep and rejoice, and the list goes on. And in the midst of that, I think that's where you have Christ particularly honored by a body that loves one another, builds itself up, even to the point where the outside world looks in is like, man, there's no community like that.
Yeah, for sure. I guess my only final thought to add to all of that is to remember that your pastors are church members.
Yeah.
Which means that they need your exhortation, which means that they need your prayers, they need your edification, they need your just presence, and I think that that's incredibly important. It's just like people look at pastors. It depends on the church culture, but a lot of churches will just look at pastors as like the guy that they are out there, they're doing all this work for the Lord, and they put them on this pedestal, And I think it's meant to be done in a way that's like honorific, like, oh, this guy's doing all this work for the Lord. How great is that? But what it ends up doing is it actually separates him from the body. And, we said earlier, like, you can't separate a member of the body from the body. It doesn't work that way. And it actually just is unhealthy ultimately from the body. And so pull your pastors into that, and be willing to serve in such a way where it gives them the freedom to be able to function as a member of the body, rather than just like, some separate overlord over off to the side or something. That's not what we want to be. That's not what we want to do. We want to foster a community, and yes, in fact, lead in a very specific way, and have that spiritual authority, but not in such a way that it actually separates us. So I don't know. I guess just keep that in mind. If you're a layman, pray for your pastor. Reach out to your pastor, text them, call them, and encourage them, because their goal is to equip you for the work of the ministry. Their goal is to dress you up for Christ, as I like to say. And while they're doing that, I'll explain that sometime. While they're doing that, your recognition should be that, well, they need that just as much as we do. So definitely be a part of that. So with all that said, let me wrap us up. I appreciate you guys for listening today. I hope this has been edifying to you and has been a blessing. If you enjoyed it and you think that somebody else that might enjoy it as well, then please share this out. Send it to as many people as you can. It's basically the way that this gets out is by word of mouth. I don't do a whole lot of advertising or marketing or anything like that, because I don't want to. That's too much work, honestly. And it's not something that really I care to do. But we do want this show to be a blessing to others. So if it's something that you were blessed by, please feel free to share it. Review this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever you were listening to it on. And we'll thank you. We'll thank you. Words are hard, man. Words are so hard.
Words are hard.
Words are hard. Lawson, hit me with a soundboard for that one. There it is. All right. Well, thank you guys for listening, and we will see you in the next episode when we begin talking a new series. Hopefully, if everything holds true, we'll be talking about the 3 offices of Christ. And so we appreciate you. Look forward to that, and we'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.